My name's Dave Whitehead. I was born in Brighton, but my dad served in the Lincolnshire Regiment from 1933 to 41, the Royal Norfolk Regiment from 41 to 44, and the Gordon Highlanders from 44 to 46. So I was keen to join the Lincolnshire Regiment when I went to the Army Recruiting Office, but by then the Lincolnshire Regiment had ceased to exist and I joined the 2nd East Anglian Regiment. I did that in 1963 and joined the Junior Tradesmen's Regiment Rill in January 1964, where I spent a year. I then joined the poachers in Cyprus on the 19th of February 1965. My family is associated with the Army. As I've said, my dad was in the regiment. My son joined the Royal Engineers, but my grandson, Tom Whitehead, named after my dad, is currently serving in the poachers in C Company. I left the battalion in 1995, having served for 30 years, man and boy. Did staff posts until I retired from the Regular Army in 1997, and I then joined Norfolk Army Cadet Force as a Cadet Executive Officer until 2013 when I retired. So, to all intents and purposes, I spent 49 years in the Royal Anglian Regiment. So I do know a little bit about it. I'm going to talk about Libya. We used to go to Libya from Cyprus. Libya, I suppose you could say, did for the Regular Army what Batas in Canada does for the Regular Army today, in that you could go there and do some major exercises, fire a lot of ammunition and do the sort of things you couldn't do in small confined spaces. We sometimes went as a battalion, but also went as sub-units attached to other major units, and I can remember going out there with the Royal Scots and I think it was the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers, but also having armoured squadrons attached to us when we went as a battalion. We would sail in LSLs, and I can remember travelling on Lancelot and Guinevere and Sir Galahad from Nicosia, from Famagusta Harbour, when you were able to get there before Cyprus was split in two. We also flew in Britannia aircraft and Argosies. Training in the desert was tough, and I can remember when we used to do advanced to contacts, we actually walked 20 miles a day doing attacks on the way, section, platoon, company and battalion attacks, going into defence at night and patrolling. In the daytime you could have temperatures up to 100 degrees, and at night it used to get to -20. We used to build sangars out of rocks because you couldn't really dig, and water was very limited. Nowadays people drink too much water in my view. We used to have our water bottles filled at breakfast in the morning and at night with our evening meal, and that water had to last us for 24 hours, and that included washing and shaving, which was mandatory every morning. There was no bathing, and after a month on exercise in the desert, our clothes were actually rotting on us. Sometimes we operated in vehicles from 3-tonners, as they were called then, and when you moved like a leaguer, like a fleet at sea, with everybody spread out. One of the memories I have is that we had 10-man ration packs. Now if you put 17 or 18 men in the back of a truck, 10-man ration packs don't divide up equally, so the platoon sergeant would open the tins, open the hardtack biscuits, open the margarine, and then various people used to spread the margarine on, slap a bit of corned beef on, and then it would be passed down the truck to the individual. Not very healthy, and I'm amazed that none of us got diarrhoea during the whole of the exercise, but our food would have been passed through 10 people's hands before you actually got to eat it. Sometimes we operated in 432s, they were the old Mark 1s, when drivers of other units would drive the vehicles and we would just operate from them. Live firing was quite different to what it is today. There were very few safety staff, and we operated quite close to live 3-inch mortar ammunition 120 millimeter backed ammunition from our Mobats, threw grenades, and obviously fired all sorts of small arms fire with very little safety staff. We were pretty self-disciplined, and therefore we never had anyone injured. Skirmishing was just rearing its ugly head then. It was called pepper potting at the time, and it replaced the old system where everybody got up and charged with bayonets fixed. I remember one time flying back from Libya. We arrived at RAF Al Adam, having spent a month in the desert. We were told we would have a meal before getting on the flight, but the master chef in the RAF cookhouse wouldn't let us in because we were all pretty filthy. We were given one shower to use for the battalion, 600 odd people, so we opted to go to the swimming pool. Beautiful clean blue water. When we got out of it, it was a pretty muddy brown colour. Other memories of the desert was that vehicles left there from the Second World War, brewed up tanks and trucks and things like that, remained remarkably preserved. The desert is an amazing place, and there was very little rust, so things were very much left as they were when they were destroyed. Knightsbridge Cemetery, which is the Graves Commission cemetery, I remember very well, and there are also three French and German cemeteries, all in fair amounts of dilapidation, and only the British one was left intact and well cared for. I also remember Tobruk Harbour, which at that stage still had the masts of ships sticking out of the water where they'd been sunk. While we were in Cyprus, I was lucky enough to take part in an expedition to the Kufra Oasis in Libya. This is a huge oasis, about 100 miles long, on the border of Egypt, Sudan and Libya. Around 16 of us took part in the expedition, using 2 3-tonners and 4 Land Rovers, and taking everything we needed with us. General Lloyd Owen of Long Range Desert Group fame was the GOC in Cyprus when we were there, and he came to see us the day before we set sail for Libya. He asked our OC if we had a Royal Engineer surveyor with us, to which the answer was no, this was going to be a totally Royal Anglian event. The GOC ordered us not to leave without a Royal Engineer surveyor. This proved to be a good idea, because some days after we got into the desert proper, we were totally lost and disorientated, having not used the surveyor at all. The OC rather rudely said to the surveyor, "Are you any good with that thing?" To which the surveyor replied, "Is 10 yards good enough for you?" From that time on, every evening when we stopped, the Royal Engineer surveyor took his bearings and told us exactly where we were. We only had one vehicle with sand tyres, and so we had to let the air pressure in the tyres of the other vehicles down to about 3 or 4 pounds per square inch. So there's a lot of schwab on them, and we didn't sink into the sand. We saw all different types of desert. Jebel, which was very sharp, stony, and could puncture tyres if they weren't fully inflated, to really soft sand where you dug in very quickly once you got into it, and that was chaos for us because we spent hours digging them out and using sand channels. We called at Bir Zelton Oil Refinery on our way down to Kufra. This was our last taste of civilization, and we had showers there. I remember our OC had taken some cigars for the American who ran the place, who introduced himself to us as Reb, and while we were there he ate half of them. We followed the Italian road for much of the distance. When I say road, they're purely poles, about twice the size of telegraph poles, and made of steel with a triangle on the top, and they were spaced out about once every 3 or 4 miles. That took us a good couple of 100 miles, and after that it was pure navigation. On one day the sand was so soft we achieved no more than 500 yards. On arrival in Kufra, we found lagoons, much like the Dead Sea, where you couldn't sink, rather thick, salty water. I'd actually travelled down with ammunition for the Chief of Police, hidden under the seat of my 4-tonner, because he'd been promoted and been given a pistol but had no ammunition. So someone in the RAOC in Cyprus had sent him a box of ammo. I was put in charge of petrol, which I picked up from a dump in Benghazi. There was so much there. I'd been briefed by our MTO about how to do fuel accounting, and when I got there I wanted to sign for the fuel, and the warrant officer in charge of it said, take as much as you want, it's been here since the Second World War. I tried to run the account properly, but as it turned out I'd used more fuel than I'd actually been given at the end of the account, so I had a good bollocking from the MTO. We had to replace 2 clutches from Land Rovers on the way down and the back axle of a 4-tonner because they'd sheared due to the heavy going. We had a back axle dropped into us by Beverley, which was taking building materials for a palace for King Idris, who was going there to die at Kufra, and of course he was replaced by Colonel Gaddafi before he got the chance to do that. My memories of Libya are of great independence, sometimes being a bit of a survivor because we were running short of water and miles away from civilization. I love the desert, and I think it's a great place for soldiering. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Bosnia now. I was quartermaster in Bosnia, so I didn't really see life up the sharp end, but I can give you a sort of flavour of what Bosnia was like. We deployed in the winter. It's extremely cold, very, very muddy, and some snow on the ground. But movement was particularly difficult, especially on the small mountain roads where vehicles like Scimitar and Spartan, for example, came into their own, but anything heavier was no good because it just destroyed the roads. Supply was extremely difficult. We were based in well up country, in Gorni Vakuf, Vitez and Maglai, and the supply line was extremely long and required travel up mountain tracks built through the mountains by the Royal Engineers. I remember we couldn't get any acid. We had to barter for acid with some of the organisations that needed fuel. Bear in mind we weren't allowed to give fuel to anyone, but that was the only way we could get battery acid, was to give fuel to the subversive organisations out there. We couldn't get toilet rolls at one stage. The UN said there was plenty in their warehouse at Zagreb, and all we had to do was demand it. The British Command Secretary said UN should supply toilet rolls, the British Army wouldn't supply them anymore, and to cut a long story short, our soldiers ended up wiping their arses on their magazines, newspapers from home, sandbags, you name it. I, as a quartermaster, got extremely annoyed about it, and I remember one day with the CO having a go at a senior UN official. Eventually we got toilet rolls from the UN. We'd had a go at the Command Secretariat as well, so we got all the toilet rolls we demanded for months from them, and the upshot of it was we were snowed under with bloody toilet rolls. But the soldiers couldn't complain, they didn't have any after that. We were unused to celebratory fire. In Bosnia, anyone that's got a gun fires off magazines and belts of ammunition for birthdays, christenings, saints' days, Christmas, you name it, they fire. This caught a few people by surprise, and only our interpreters could let us know when that was likely to happen. Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, was the most bureaucratic place I'd ever come across. Moving across tribal boundaries between Muslim, Croat and Serb areas was a nightmare. and you could normally expect to be held up for hours, if not days. We looked after and administered a locating troop in Sarajevo. They were based near the old ice rink where Torval and Dean won their medals, which had been shot absolutely to pieces. It was full of holes. The devastation was everywhere, and it's not unusual to see lampposts riddled with bullet holes. Children out there were very fit, and if you didn't have kit tied down on your Land Rovers and trucks when you went through, if you got going slow up a hill, it's amazing because a 6 or 7-year-old child could run faster with your Bergen than you could with all your flak jacket and your weapon and your helmet and everything else. While we were out there, the United Nations insisted on an in and out policy. That meant they would not pay for or replace any British Army equipment which hadn't been registered with them. This caused a great deal of political infighting by the British government and the United Nations, and basically Pakistani unit could send its soldiers out there with no weapons, no vehicles, no food, and the UN would equip them. Because we took all our stuff out there before the UN mandate, the UN were very obstinate in replacing anything that we lost or had destroyed. You couldn't move after dark in Bosnia. The food was excellent, and therefore there was a big danger of soldiers eating too much and putting on weight. We overcame this with fitness training and running in the daytime. We worked, and under command our CO had Canadians, Swedes, New Zealanders, as well as various other British military units like the Forward Recovery Group, Ordnance Corps people and so on. I'd like to talk about sewage. Royal Engineers did a marvellous job with what we called the ship gobblers. This was basically a 40-foot ISO container with a sewage disposal unit inside it. They were always breaking down, and the poor old duty Royal Engineer always had to fix it. And of course there were no spares, so they had to make spares and so on. The Croats in Vitez complained that the sewage disposal units were pouring neat sewage into their rivers, and so the UN set up a contract for them to dispose of it, and all that happened was the Croats dispose of it in the rivers. One interesting time for me out there was when one of our liaison officers, a British liaison officer, organised a cultural evening for us, and this was when I saw belly dancing for the first time. Most people think belly dancing originated in Egypt. It actually originated in Bosnia, and it was done for a visit of the Sultan when it was part of the Turkish Empire. And it was absolutely amazing dancing by men and women, and it exceeds the fitness and beautiful dancing techniques of river dance. Much better than that, and a lot sexier too. And that's all I've got to say about Bosnia. I'd just like to talk now about my thoughts when I arrived in the poachers. It was in Alexander Barracks, Dekelia in Cyprus on the 19th of February 1965. In those days, bugle calls were used for almost everything. Reveille, meals, first parade, RSM's detail, mail, CO's orders, retreat, last post, and they were, and you knew exactly what you were doing with those bugle calls. They were done every day, with regular monotony. We had a band. Probably the only thing I'll never forgive the army for is getting rid of battalion bands. And of course the band, when they were in station, were always playing, and wherever you were in the barracks, you heard the band playing. We used to do a lot of training in BMH Valley, and because when I joined the battalion I'd been trained as a driver radio operator and very little infantry work, I was used as enemy the first time, There was a shortage of ammunition. I was given 2 blank rounds and told I could fire 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon during platoon attack training. In Cyprus, we were constantly on duties when we weren't on exercise. The battalion guarded the barracks, the ammunition sub-depot, petrol sub-depot, airfield, Anzio camp, which was a reserve camp, water pipeline, the desalination plant, the saddle club, BFPS, and I'm sure there are others, but we've spent an awful lot of time on guard. We also had, while we were in Dekelia, an air platoon, and we supplied not the pilots but the ground staff, radio operators and so on for a Oster Army Air Corps flight, and so some of the battalion wore light berets. Finally, my overriding memories of the battalion is of all the good soldiers I met, who generally speaking were cheerful, resilient, hard-working and efficient. Some of them of course died, and I was there when they were buried. In some cases I was there when they died. But my overriding memory is of the good men who served in the battalion.